Hello and welcome to today's conversation. How are you doing today, Chuck?
I'm doing very well, Martin. How are you doing?
I'm doing fabulous. Thank you for asking. Chuck, today I'd like to talk about something that's really near and dear to, I think, both of our hearts. And that is a word. We were recently having a conversation and you used a word with me in conversation. You used the word leadership.
Yes.
And when you said leadership, you said it's almost become a dead word in that it means so much, it almost means nothing anymore. And I thought that was such an important takeaway because, as you know, I love leadership. I know you love leadership. There's an entire industry out there around leadership. And if I go to our current command that is with the forces and said leadership, I'm sure if I walked up and down the hallway, and especially if I walked up and down the hallway of different ranks, the word leadership is going to mean far different in the junior mess than it is at the wardroom. So maybe if you could tell me a little bit about what you were thinking when you said, hey, leadership's become a dead word, and what are some of the things we might want to do about that fact?
Well, we could do so much, but to begin with a definition, I mean, the classic definition of leadership is that a good leader influences subordinates to do what they ordinarily wouldn't necessarily want to do, or I think Eisenhower is famously quoted as saying leadership is telling people to go to hell and making them look forward to going, that sort of thing. My difficulty is that just about anybody that retires from the military and then gets involved in something, they give themselves the tag leader. Right? I'm a leader. Fair enough. Maybe when we were in the military, they may have been a leader. They may have got some leadership training. But the word is, it's like very. What does very mean? Well, this is very good. Well, this is very bad. At a certain point, the word doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just your brain shuts off when you hear that word because it is overused. And I fear that the word leader is overused. And of course, we've got a broader spectrum than we did when I was younger. I mean, when I was a kid or even as a young adult, I didn't know what an influencer was. I'm not sure it was even a noun, right? So it's fair to say that most people who consider themselves to be leaders are in one way or another. But what that means to them may be totally different, as you point out, in the junior ranks mess, as to the sergeant's mess, as to the officer's mess, as to the general officer's mess, or in cabinet, or in Congress, right? Or in the church. Because leadership takes on so many different forms based on what it is that's being asked of the leader.
I love where you're going with that. I was recently listening to generative learning for AI, and they were saying that they were having a problem in AI with a word like big. Because I could say that's a big ant, or I could say that's a big elephant. And they're relative to context. Yep. And AI doesn't know how to determine context. Is there a context that we should be considering for leadership? And is there a context that our military uses for leadership that may or may not help influence its thinking in one way or another?
So I have two answers to that question. One is if you're asking me as a personal definition and how I feel about that. And the other one is institutional. And there's been this conflict, and this conflict continues to this day. And that is, there's personal leadership, and then there's institutional leadership. And sometimes the people that we move to higher ranks in organizations, whether it's the Bank of Canada, or whether it's the Canadian Army or the Royal Canadian Navy, if the leader doesn't appreciate the two sides of that coin, then that individual may not serve the purpose for which they were promoted. Let me give you an example. So I've known, as you and I have discussed, because of how I lived my life when I was in the Army, I knew a lot of guys who went on to become general officers. I left early. But in my own way, I commanded a whole bunch of things a whole bunch of times. I personally always saw an aspect of leadership that was actually never taught to me when I was in the military. It was taught to me by my father, and that is that there is a moral obligation in leadership. If you don't feel a moral obligation towards the people that follow you, then you're missing a piece of your leadership spectrum. On the other hand, there is the institutional side of leadership, whereby you say, well, personally, this is what I want. But what I want is less important than what the institution needs. Right? And I think probably the best single example of that is how the Roman Church chooses its pope. Because, of course, in the modern era, all popes start as being bishops and then become cardinals, and then the College of Cardinals sits and chooses. They've all got their own moral, what's the word I'm looking for? They've all got their own moral compass. And we like to think that, well, as cardinals, they would all more or less be pointing that compass in the same direction, but not necessarily. I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury, stepping outside the Roman Church to the English Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury 20 years ago famously made headlines because he questioned the divinity of Christ. And people were like, how can you be the Archbishop of Canterbury and question the divinity of the Christ? Right? Now, he went on to explain that he had been slightly misquoted, right? But if I say, well, we need to promote that individual to lead that organization, and that individual is one of these really individual gung-ho, follow me boys type of guy, but really doesn't understand what the organization needs, that may be exactly the wrong type of person, because that person will forget that it's not about what he wants or she wants. It's about what the organization needs. And that's tough, right? Especially for someone who's, what's the word I'm looking for? When you're if you're a very charismatic person and you've always used that charisma to carry you forward, then you may have trouble understanding what it is that the organization that you've been asked to lead actually needs. And we have an excellent example, right? Morality aside, let's put that aside. Donald Trump. Let's not talk about morality. Let's just talk about his own personal leadership as a businessman. He got where he got to, not because he was good at it. He got there because of his personal charisma, right? As I say, I don't want to talk about the morality, him as a human being, just him as a business person. He got to where he got by his personal charisma. His personal charisma is not what the United States needs right now, and it's being demonstrated in spades. The laws that he's pushing through, the decisions that he's making, will come back and bite American society. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but at 71, I've seen this show before. This isn't my first circus. Or what's the expression? It's not my first rodeo.
As you say that, I'm reminded of the old saying, what's popular is not always right. What's right is not always popular. And as I think about that, and I think about the quotes you gave earlier, we were talking about influence, and certainly a man like Donald Trump has a lot of influence, not only in terms of his own country, but globally. But with those quotes you gave earlier about wanting to walk to hell and influence, I have two words that I want to hold up because I see both as motivating factors. And one is influencer. I'm trying to change your behavior. And the other one is inspiration. And so both have a space in leadership. Now, in the way that I've come to in coaching define leadership, I use the word inspiration very clearly because you're moving from a little of what you were talking about with the Archbishop of Canterbury from a pure motive. It has that moral ground. I'm not trying to inspire you for something bad. I'm trying to inspire you for something that can affect the collective good. Influence may or may not have that collective good in mind, depending on the influencer. So maybe what are some of your thoughts around inspiration and influence?
And it's interesting that you asked me because I had, first of all, I love words in all languages. If I could have, I would have taken a university undergraduate degree in etymology, how languages develop. I think we use the word inspiration incorrectly. Inspiration has a Latin root, which means to breathe in, right? And so when you breathe in, you are in fact giving yourself an idea. When you inspire, it is in many ways autodidactic, right? You are teaching yourself something. So then that raises the question, can I inspire you? How can I inspire you? Well, I suppose if we really want to get nerdy about it, I can push out an idea and you can breathe it in, right? But isn't that really influencing as opposed to inspiring, right? You, go ahead.
Well, interesting, because when I look up the Latin, and I love the etymology of inspiration, the version I tend to use is the breath or the wind that moves.
Right.
And so that could be bidirectional.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, me passing it and then you grabbing it and breathing it in.
Yeah.
Sure. But I don't think that's how most people use the word. Maybe that's how you use the word. I've never listened to one of your leadership lectures. I guess that's a piece of my education I'm going to have to correct. But yeah. So, but there's, in my mind at least, there's clearly a difference,
Yes.
right? There's a difference between influencing someone and inspiring someone, right? Because and it's sort of like two clouds coming together. It's really difficult to try and pin down where the dividing line is, because in some cases there are clear dividing lines. So let me give you an example from German. So I remember having a long heart-to-heart with my course director when I was at the German War College, and he was, apart from just being a born educator, he was a professional Army officer. And he was trying to get me to understand certain things. And he was always questioning me. And one of the times we had this little chat, he said to me, well, Major Oliviero, are we talking about lehren? Or are we talking about teaching? Or are we talking about prägen? Are we talking about pressing? And I said, you've lost me. What are you talking about? So, well, I can force something on a soldier, prägen, right? Or drucken, which is to print or to press down. He says, so I can force my ideas, or I can force soldiers to do certain things simply by my force of personality or the legality of me being a colonel and my soldier being a corporal. Because if it's a legal order, they have to obey me. Or I could teach them. I could lead them by teaching them. And certainly when it comes to an officer leading another officer, we use more in the terms of teaching than we do in the terms of pushing on or forcing. And I'd never really thought about that before. It had never really occurred to me, right? Call me a late bloomer. It just, maybe it's because in my time in the Canadian Army, before going to the German War College, these kinds of things were not prevalent. There was not a whole lot of professional military education, PME. Every military has PME, but in the Canadian military in the 1970s and the 1980s, we still had a very British outlook, which was, officers are born leaders, right? You can tell an officer in the shower just by how he stands. No clothes, no rank. And of course, we were raised in our regiments to believe that, right? And in the Navy, where I started, it was upper deck, lower deck, right? And if you had someone who was commissioned from the ranks, then quite often, if they would have a social faux pas, would be the issue of, he was never able to make the leap from the petty officer's mess to the wardroom, right? Well, Okay, there are bits of that that are true, but that model never really describes or explains why it is that you could have a bunch of individuals have, maybe wearing shorts and t-shirts, and given a task, someone will step out and be the leader, right? And that person may be someone that has no rank. It just has natural charisma, or, is gifted in some way. In fact, I always found it interesting that in the German operations manual, the German Army operations manual, there is a paragraph in that manual that hasn't changed since it was written in 1919. And it's in the form of a question. It was, who who will come to the fore in a crisis situation? Someone who in peacetime you have neglected. Because they recognized even then that the military, and we're still not as good at this as we'd like to be. The military has actually two dichotomies split twice. All right. So it's, like the egg cell that splits and then splits again. We've got the military in action. So the ships at sea that are fighting, aircraft that are on operations, the army that is in the field or on a mission, and then you've got the garrison force. Now, what's the Navy doing in the dockyard? What's the Air Force doing when the planes are all sitting on the ground? What's the Army doing in garrison? Right? And so we for a long time, and I think to this day, we tend to keep them separate in our head, as opposed to living every day the same way. Right? We have great platitudes, right? That, train the way you fight, right? Train smarter, not harder, But they're just platitudes. They don't mean anything, because they don't mean anything until you actually put them in place. And I'm not sure we're as good at that as we could be. And I guess to close the loop from my long-winded diatribe, to come back to your issue about, today's military, today's leadership, the reality of choosing someone like a chief of the defense staff, right? And shout out to Jenny Carignan. She's doing a great job. Her leadership has to be that delicate balance of being able to motivate, inspire, influence three different services. She's a combat engineer. And at the same time, every day, wake up, go into an office and run, or at least lead, the largest civilian workforce in Canada, right? We have more civilian members of the Department of National Defense than any other department.
That's a wonderful observation. And if I could, I'd love to ask this question around that space. Shout out, because, you're doing a wonderful job out there. Where do you think, as a military, the Canadian Forces today is doing really well at inspiring and really well at influencing? And where are some places they could lean into to create more effectiveness?
Well, my initial response has to be, I'm not sure, because I haven't worn a uniform in, I don't know, decade and a half. No, more than that. I keep forgetting how old I am. 2 decades. So, but I have, routine contact with today's Canadian Armed Forces, because I have two sons who are commissioned officers, one in the RCAF and one in the Army. And through conversations with them, they tell me what's good, what's bad. And I pay attention to the kind of leadership that they're living under. So based on those limiting factors, I would say the military today is much better at understanding the great diversity that we have in the armed forces that we always tended to want to quash, right? We were proud of the fact that we had Canadians from all walks of life, But when I joined the military, we didn't have many Canadians of color. We certainly didn't talk about people who weren't sexually binary, right? So you're either male or female, you're either gay or straight, right? And you're only allowed to be one, right? Uh, so we now recognize that we need to include them. They're citizens and they're humans, and they deserve the self-respect and the marks of respect that everyone deserves. So we're better at that. We're better at understanding that just because a soldier or sailor or air crew that is working for you isn't necessarily at your intellectual level doesn't mean that they're stupid, right? I mean, I remember quite, I'm sorry to say this, but I remember quite well, both when I was in the Navy and then later in the Army, when, senior officers, but to be blunt, more often senior NCOs, when a soldier would do something that they didn't like, they went, "What the hell's wrong with you? Are you stupid or what?" That was, forgetting that, that poor soldier or sailor may be 17 years old, having just not even finished high school, joined the military, and suddenly they're on a warship. And what is obvious to the chief, because the chief's lived the last 25 years on a warship, is not obvious to that 17-year-old. Same thing in the Army, right? You may have grown up in the inner city like me, never even seen a tracked vehicle other than maybe a bulldozer. And suddenly you're driving this 70-ton monster and you don't fully appreciate what happens when you stop one of the tracks. It's not that you're stupid. It's just that it's just not part of your world, not part of your experiential base. So good and bad.
Is there any area you see that maybe could be considered more? Like you say, we've socially become more aware. And when I think back, I joined in the 90s. Be and reflect Canada. If I said that sentence, be and reflect Canada in the 90s, and I said that sentence today there is a much better understanding of being and reflecting Canada.
Yes.
What do you think are some of the ways in which we could still lean into being and reflecting Canada?
Good question. Let me come at it from a different perspective. One of the issues that I have that we have been obsessed with, and when I say we, Canadian society and many of the national institutions, we have been obsessed with identity, politics, and policies, right? National Spaghetti Day, National Independence Day, National Indigenous Day, National Italian Canadian Day. Like, this is National Hot Dog Month. Wow. I mean, I get it if you're trying to market something, but we shouldn't be dividing our population like you slice and dice ingredients for a menu. So I remember, and unfortunately he's disgraced himself now, but when I was younger, Bill Cosby was very much an ideal that a lot of people, we held him to a higher standard. He was, a great dad on that TV show that he, Dr. Huxtable. But in personal life, he was interviewed one time and asked about American Black History Month. And we now have Black History Month in Canada. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. In many ways, I think it's counterproductive. And I am an Italian immigrant, came to this country when I was 2 years old. But if you ask me, what am I? I'm a Canadian. I don't like hyphenated identities because I think it diminishes both sides. So I am a Canadian, full-blooded, but my heritage is Italian. Right? My boys, are, as one person said to them, disparagingly, they're half-breeds, right? Because their mother's seventh generation Canadian, and I'm only, not even first generation. So in terms of what that means and, how it relates to everything that you and I have been talking about, I guess if I were asked to explain it in one word, I would like us to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you think might be a way of becoming more inclusive? Is there something specific you can see or that you've experienced where you could say, that's a thing we might want to lean into?
I think it's by reminding everybody all the time that we're Canadian first. So I remember one of the parades that I had when I commanded my tank regiment. So I had 5 squadrons. One of them was a francophone squadron, and most of the soldiers came in that squadron came from Quebec. And so, as a working language inside the tank squadron, they spoke French. And most of the regiment said, "Well, yeah, A squadron is a francophone squadron. The rest of us are anglophone squadrons." And I would always stop them when they would say that. And I remember saying to everybody on parades, "Stop! I want to make this absolutely clear. Right? First of all, there are no distinct squadrons. I know you have different names. All of you belong to me. All of these tanks belong to me. I lend them to those majors, and then we break them into squadrons." That's point number one. But more importantly, we are one regiment, and I don't have a francophone squadron and 4 anglophone squadrons. I got one regiment, and one of them happens to prefer to speak a national language, and the other ones prefer to speak the other national language. That doesn't make them distinct. We're all part of one regiment. Canada's the same way.
I've called that for years the true north, strong and free. It is the one line that I think, regardless of what unit you're in, what regiment, what rank, whatever, you can look at true north, strong and free and go, I'm behind that.
Agreed.
And I do want to say thank you for today's conversation on leadership. Like I said, it's never easy to talk about leadership because it's so many things to so many people. Any final words on leadership before we close out?
Complicated subject. Love to talk about it. We got to do this again.
Fantastic. And we will do it again. Thank you so much. And for everyone out there, have a great day.